All right.
Test.
I just got the word. We're ready to start. So let's say a prayer before we begin. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Good and gracious God, we travel to a land that is holy to three religions, to a place that you've made holy through your handiwork among us. It has been your presence in that land and in all lands that make them holy. Help us to understand what it is that you want us to see and come to understand your presence more fully in our lives. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Remind people that I have them all muted and they have to ask me questions in chat. And I've been told to remind you that you're all muted. And so if you have a question, you hit chat and type it up. And then what will happen is that will be passed on to me. So I'm going to start by saying that my first time in the Holy Land was in 1984. I was at a parish, St. John's in Jackson, and the pastor had had a heart attack and a stroke in 83. And we were in the middle of renovating the church, and I took care of him and I took care of the parish and finished up the renovation and did all of that. And his thank you gift was a trip to Rome and the Holy Land. And when he said this is what he wanted to do to thank me, I said, you know, Frank, a nice dinner would have been more than enough to say thank you, but it's kind of hard to negotiate down now. And so I ended up going to the Holy Land in 1984, and it was a wonderful, wonderful trip. It was with 40 other priests. And since then, I've taken 6 groups back there. So it's fun to share the experience with new people. The truth is that anyone who has ever been to the Holy Land, and there are some of the people who are watching this evening who have been there with me, you never hear or read the scriptures the same again. You always have this experience of reliving the journey, and that's the wonderful thing. One thing that I always recommend to any of the groups that have gone with me is that they read a Michener novel, James Michener, called The Source, because it gives readers the history of the 11,000 years that the Holy Land has been inhabited by human beings. 11,000 years. We don't have time to read the book now, but I'd like to share a few facts with you that might help you understand the different places you're going to see as we make this virtual pilgrimage. Again, the history of the Holy Land, as far as human habitation, goes back 11,000 years. The city of Jericho is one of the oldest settlements in the Holy Land and in the world. It's been destroyed and rebuilt 20 times. The city of Jerusalem has also been destroyed and rebuilt several times, and the present old city that's now surrounded by 2.8 miles of walls. Those walls of the old city were rebuilt from 1535 to 1543 by Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan. And because the city has been destroyed and rebuilt several times, that means that the city of Jesus is actually 10 feet lower than the present old city that dates back to the 1500s. And the city of David, which occurs about 1,000 years before Jesus, is another 10 feet below. So the present old city of Jerusalem that dates back to 1535 is 20 feet above the city of David because of all of the debris that's come from destruction and rebuilding. So much has happened in that area that we call the Holy Land that our virtual pilgrimage will only cover the events of Jesus. I'm not going to go into the Old Testament accounts because otherwise we would be here forever. So what I'm talking about now is only the gospel accounts. I'd like to give you some history, some background, which for those of you who know me, this is not a big surprise. In 37 BC, the independent Jewish state of Israel was made a client state of Rome. There was a problem with who was going to become the high priest leader of the people. There were different families that were arguing. And so they asked Pompey, who was in the area, to help settle it. And he came in and he settled it by saying, well, the Romans will be in charge. And the state of Israel at that point in the time of Jesus lost its independence and became a client state of Rome. And they made Herod the Great the king of Palestine. Herod was given the surtitle great because he was a great builder. He was not a great human being. He killed several of his own family, including his sons, because he was always afraid of people trying to usurp his throne. And so, the story is told of Caesar Augustus saying it would be safer to be Herod's dog than to be one of his children. We don't know if that's a true story, but it does speak volumes about why Herod was not so great, even though he was a great builder. One of the things that he did besides building palaces, fortresses, and cities, he began construction and reconstruction on the 20-acre complex that is the temple in Jerusalem. He began that in the years well before Jesus was born, and it wasn't completed until 63 AD. So it was almost 100 years that he reconstructed the temple and expanded it to make it one of the great wonders of the ancient world. In 66 AD, 3 years after the reconstruction of the temple was completed, there came the first Jewish revolt against Rome. The signal was, they think, partly because the temple was completed, and they decided that this must be the signal that it's time to now go into revolt against Rome. What ended up was the city was destroyed, the temple was destroyed in the reconquest by the Romans. And the destruction that the Romans brought stretched from Galilee to the Dead Sea. Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Afterwards, Jerusalem was partially rebuilt, but then in 132, there was a second revolt, and the city was then attacked and destroyed by the Romans under the Emperor Hadrian. And when he rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, he rebuilt it as a Roman colony. It was completely different in its layout from what it had been in the ancient world before that. Instead of walls that kind of meandered around, it was built in the form of a rectangle with two streets that bisected it, north and south, east and west, and created four quadrants. And while the place of the Holy Sepulchre, while the place of the tomb of Jesus was outside the city, by the time Hadrian finished building, it was now inside the city walls. There is evidence that Christians were already coming and praying at the site in Jerusalem. And so to keep them away, because Hadrian forbid, after he destroyed the city, he renamed it and made it a Roman colony and called it Aelia Capitolina. He gave it a Roman name, and Jews and Christians were forbidden to enter the city. And one of the things that he did to make sure that they stayed away from where the tomb of Christ had been was he built a pagan temple over it to keep people away. He did the same thing in Bethlehem because he heard that there were pilgrims going there. And so those two sites that were already being venerated by the end of the first century were now covered with pagan temples under Hadrian. When Constantine becomes emperor in 313, he now allows Christians to re-enter the city and renames it Jerusalem. Not only that, but he has a basilica built over, tears down that temple and has a basilica, a big church, built over Calvary and the Holy Sepulchre, the burial place of Jesus. And this new church is named the Church of the Resurrection, because it venerates that event. He also had a second basilica built over the place where it was believed that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And so by 325, there were these two great churches that were already built in Jerusalem and Bethlehem because pilgrims now began to flock to those places. For over 300 years, there were other churches built over many sites that have been venerated as a site of gospel events, but we don't actually know where many of those things. Sometimes I really think that what it is somebody said, you know what? We could make a killing by telling them that this is where Jesus did this. And then they sold the land to the Romans and they built a church there and somebody pocketed a lot of money. We don't know for where a lot of things happen because none of those sites were marked and so much destruction had occurred that it would be hard to even find them. But the Byzantines built churches over many of those sites that commemorated different events in the gospel. And pilgrims went to those places. In 637, Jerusalem was conquered by the Muslims, who opened the city to Muslims, Jews, and Christians. And so it was almost 500 years that the Jews were forbidden to enter Jerusalem. It wasn't until the Muslims conquered that they were allowed to return. In the process of conquering, there were some churches destroyed. And one of the things that was most important was by the end of the 7th century, in 691, on what had been Temple Mount, where the first and second Jewish temples were built, there was a golden dome shrine built over a place where Muslims believed Muhammad had traveled on a horse from Mecca to Jerusalem, to heaven and back. And the place where he ascended became a shrine, and it's called the Dome of the Rock. Nearby, there's a much larger mosque where Muslims go to pray. But there's that golden dome, and you saw that in the picture when we first started, when this whole thing about the virtual pilgrimage came up.
Behind your left shoulder right now.
It's behind my left shoulder. You can see it right over there. Anyway, in 1009, the Caliph ordered the destruction of the Church of the Resurrection, and he closed the Holy Land to Christian pilgrims. That was the beginning of the Crusades. When the people in Europe heard this, they were aghast because even during the time of the Muslims from 637 up until this period, Christians still went to the Holy Land on pilgrimage. That was not a problem until the year 1009. And then it was cut off. And as a result, we have the Crusades that started, and those started by 1095. They lasted from 1095 until 1291. There were 8 different crusades that occurred during that time. And in the midst of that time, St. Francis of Assisi made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and he spent time in Jerusalem. He went to and mapped out the place where he thought that Jesus had made his journey from condemnation to crucifixion and burial. And he called it the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows. And we'll talk about that again later. But it was in 1217 that St. Francis laid that out. He also went to Bethlehem. And what he did when he came back to Italy was he did 2 things. He created the Stations of the Cross like we did during Lent, because he wanted people to be able, who would never get to the Holy Land, to have some experience of what it was like to be there, to walk that way of the Lord's sorrow. He also went to Bethlehem and saw the cave that it was believed the place that Jesus was born. And so he came back, and to show the people, he created this nativity set that now becomes part of our Christian tradition and our Christmas tradition, where we have these little images that remind us of where and how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. The other thing Francis did, Francis was rather fearless. He walked through the warring lines of Muslims and Christians who were fighting each other, walked to Cairo, and went and saw the caliph because he wanted to help negotiate a peace. And the caliph was so impressed by this small, diminutive little man who came and wanted to talk about peace that he gave Francis his own ring with the seal of the caliph on it. And he also gave to the Franciscans the custody of all the churches that still remained in the Holy Land. And so from that time on, the Franciscans have been a huge presence in the many churches in the Holy Land. Between 1095 and 1291, there were, and this is what I'm seeing, I'm not seeing anything of these.
We haven't started that yet.
Okay, all right, there's a question. Had the Romans not destroyed Jerusalem, would Christianity have remained a sect of Judaism? And I'm going to say I have no clue. There's no way of knowing. I would think that no matter what happened in Jerusalem, as Christianity continued to grow with more and more Gentiles, it would have become less and less Jewish. And I think that it was inevitable that that's what happened. But after those 200 years of crusades, the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem ended up being destroyed by the invading Muslims again. And during that time, the Crusaders built several churches. And so we had the original churches built by the Byzantines after the time of Constantine. We had churches built during the time of the Crusades, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that was rebuilt by them. And then when the Muslims returned, there were no more churches being built. But what happened is that there was a struggle for who would control things in the Holy Land. From the end of the Crusades until 1922. So we're talking about from 1295 until 1922, the control of the churches in Jerusalem, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, kept going back and forth between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics, the Franciscans and the Orthodox. And usually the way it worked was that you bribed the governor, and the governor would take the biggest bribe, and that group would be the ones who were in charge of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of Bethlehem. And it would go back and forth. They would be not only squabbles, but there would be almost riots between the different clergy. And finally, in 1757, the Ottomans decided they were tired of all this, and they established what was called the status quo. And it decreed that the church should be controlled. It would be divided up, and each group would have its own place that they would control. So there was a Roman Catholic area, there was a Greek Orthodox area, there was a Syrian Orthodox area, there was a Coptic Orthodox area, there was an Armenian Apostolic area. The church was divided up into different areas, and those different sects of Christianity had control. But nobody had absolute control over it because the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre were held by a Muslim family that still controls locking and unlocking the church every day. It's not any Christian that does it, it's the Muslims because of the status quo. In the 18th century, the treaties of Paris and Berlin both took that status quo and made it part of the treaties between countries in Europe. So it became this whole system of how these areas were going to be controlled. And as a result, when we get to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, you're going to see a ladder above the doorway of the basilica. And it's called the immovable ladder because it was there in 1728 when the status quo was put into effect. And because it was there, it cannot be removed because they can't agree on doing that. In fact, in 1922, there was an earthquake in Jerusalem, and it took them the better part of 70 years to decide how they were going to repair the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre because they couldn't agree. They couldn't agree on who was going to do it, how it was going to be done, and who was going to pay for it. And so it took them 70 years to do that. And, the status quo. So the Easter Vigil, as it was done in 1728, was at 6 a.m. And so the Roman Catholics on Holy Saturday could go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and celebrate Holy Saturday at 6 a.m. We can't do it in the evening because the status quo won't allow that, even though our liturgy has changed. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire went into decline, and so many corrupt officials sold off historic sites to Europeans. And the Holy Land itself, several churches that were destroyed after the Crusades or before the Crusades were purchased by the Franciscans and other European orders. And so they bought this land in hopes of rebuilding churches. And so since about 1850 until the 21st century, the Franciscans especially have been rebuilding churches on the holy sites that once had a Crusader church that was destroyed, and before that, a Byzantine church. I'm just going to finish by saying that basically there are 6 periods of the Holy Land. The Roman period from 37 to 325, the Byzantine period after Constantine from 325 to 637, the Muslim period from 637 to 1095, the Crusader period from 1095 to 1291, the Ottoman Muslims from 1291 to 1922. And then in the 20th century, we have the British Mandate and the State of Israel. Okay, I lost my question, so we're going to go into the virtual tour. What you saw first was the map of Israel in the time of Jesus. And I'd like to, Ron, I've got all these folks and I can't see the picture. I can't see the picture. Ron? Sorry, I need to know what I'm telling you about. And you're all covering it.
I gotta change your view. I tell you, priest.
I know. Okay. I think that's the Getz house. Okay.
There we
We
go.
want to go back to the map.
Okay, I'll go back to that. Yeah, priest needs his deacon.
I just want to point out that in the time of Jesus, there were 3 different parts of Palestine, which was the Roman name of this area. It was called the province of Palestine. There was Galilee in the north, and you can see the different places there. There was Samaria in the center, which had once been the ancient kingdom of Israel. And then there's the kingdom of Judah, which is in the south, that later became known as Judea. When you hear about the 10 cities or the Decapolis, that is to the east of Galilee and Samaria. There were 10 pagan or Gentile cities built there, a lot of them during the time of Herod the Great. And so when you see this, Jesus would have walked from Cana or Capernaum or Nazareth down to Jerusalem. It's about 90 miles down. And they always talk about it as not going down, but going up, because Galilee is a plain. When you get into Samaria, you start getting into the mountains. And when you get into Judea, you get into higher mountains. And so Jerusalem is built on a series of mountains in the kingdom of Judah, or what's now called Judea. And so you don't go down to Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem when you're coming even from the north, because you have this higher elevation. We're going back to Nazareth because that's where the story of Jesus begins. And we're going to look now at the Church of the Annunciation. This church was built in the 20th century. It was built, and I will talk later about an architect whose name was Bertoluzzi. And Bertoluzzi was an Italian priest who was an architect who designed many of the churches in Palestine. The one that he desperately wanted to build was this church, the Church of the Annunciation in Nazareth. And he lost the commission. And the reason is because, like many churches, it had a dome, but it looked too much like a mosque. And so he lost the commission to a different architect. And the dome that's built above the altar in Nazareth and the Church of the Annunciation, you can't see it very well from this view, but when you go inside, it looks like it's fluted. It's like a lily turned upside down over the altar. And that's what the architect intended, because as we know, Mary is depicted as a lily because of her purity. And that was the image. And so the altar is on the main floor, and scattered throughout the basilica are different images of Mary from all different countries in the world. And so there are approximately 90 different images of Mary that show her as a Korean, as a Native American Indian, as a mestizo, as an African, as a person from China or Japan. It's all these different images of Mary clothed in a different culture. And that in and of itself makes it a wonderful spot to visit. But there's the main floor where the main basilica is, where people gather to pray. But then down below, in front of the altar, the main altar, you see down here now where there is a special altar. This is the grotto. That first picture and now the second picture, you can see the altar in the back and then the altar in front. The altar in back is actually the area what it was always celebrated as the house of Mary. This is where Mary would have seen the angel. Was this the exact spot? We don't know. But we do know that there was a Byzantine church there, that there was a Crusader church there. Both of them have been destroyed, and this church is built on those ruins. And this is a spot that was always venerated as where the Annunciation took place. This is where the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, and that's what's depicted above the altar in that device up above. And you see the Holy Spirit descending, because this is where Jesus would have been conceived according to the tradition. Whether or not it's true, we don't know, but it's a good tradition. And these are two spots, and this is in the crypt below the main basilica. Most people worship up above, but then pilgrims oftentimes go below. This is a parish church for the city of Nazareth as well, which at one point had the largest Christian population in Israel. This is a first century spring that is in the site of that, where if Mary, this was her house nearby, this is where she would have come to get water so that she would be able to bake and wash and do all the things that were needed, because water had to be carried usually in the morning to the house and was used during the day. And the spring was used, we know, in the first century. We know that after Mary received the message from the angel Gabriel, in the message itself, when Mary said, "How can this be?" and the angel said, "Know that Elizabeth, your kinswoman, is also pregnant She who was considered barren is now in her 6th month, for nothing is impossible with God. And so Mary left Nazareth and journeyed all the way down past Jerusalem to a town called Ein Kerem. And that's where Elizabeth and Zechariah lived. And that's where John the Baptizer was born. And so there are 2 churches in Ein Kerem. And what's interesting is there's a valley between these 2 churches. One is the church of John the Baptizer, which celebrates his birth. That's what you're seeing right now. And it's decorated with these lovely tiles that come from Spain, because the Spanish monarch donated all of these tiles to embellish the church here. But this is the church of John the Baptizer that celebrates his birth. And the other one on the other side of the hill is the Church of the Visitation. Now, why we have 2 different churches for where Mary would have met Elizabeth and where John was born, we have no clue. But that's what we've got. Again, do we go to venerate the site? No, we go to venerate the event, to remember what happened. And in the Church of the Visitation in Ein Kerem, there is this beautiful fresco on the wall that shows Mary and Elizabeth greeting one another, both obviously pregnant, and greeting one another as Elizabeth recognizes Mary as the mother of the Lord. Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb, she said. And that's what's depicted in this image. In the church above, that's in a lower spot. In the church above, we see all of these different murals. Again, this is where pilgrims would gather to pray. Down below is kind of the spot where you go to remember. And there's something interesting about that little spot down there, because in that lower level, there is another fresco that depicts John the Baptizer being hidden by Elizabeth behind a rock. And it comes from the fact that Herod, who was terribly afraid that somebody was going to try and take away his power, Herod wanted to destroy all the children in Bethlehem and around. And Ein Kerem is close enough to Bethlehem that the story, according to the legends, that John the Baptizer was in danger of being put to death as well. And so Elizabeth hid him behind this rock. And that's depicted in that little shrine down below this church. And it again, this is built in the 20th century over a place that was always venerated as a place of the visitation. We know that after Mary received the message from the angel Gabriel, she and Joseph made their way down to Bethlehem, and that's where Jesus was born. When we tend to think of the Church of the Nativity as being some beautiful, beautiful sight, it is to some extent, but it's a very, very ancient church. It was built by Constantine, and the basic Constantinian church that was built around 325 is still there and still used today. But over the years, because of the Crusades, because of the attacks, it had to be fortified and protected. And so this is the Church of the Nativity on the outside. You see the bell tower, but it doesn't look very churchy. It looks more like a fortress, because that's exactly what was happening. There's a picture of the doorway that you can see across the plaza, and we're going to see people going in that doorway, and you'll be able to know what I mean when I say that it's actually very small. In order to get in, you have to either bend down or go in on your knees. I don't do this very well, because it certainly wasn't built for somebody who is 6'3". And so people who go with me have always had great fun watching me try to get through this door. The reason the doorway, and you can see where the doorway was, the reason why it was made so small was because the Muslims would ride their horses in. And so to prevent that from happening, they blocked up the doorway and made this small entrance so that anybody who came into the Church of the Nativity had to bow their heads before the Lord. And so that's why we have such a low doorway. The church is above, and the typical way churches were built, like the church in Nazareth. Remember, we have the upper church and the lower church, the crypt, which is where the sacred place was. That was where it was believed over the centuries to be Mary's house. The same thing is here in Bethlehem. We have the upper church where people prayed, but then underneath the altar, and this is right underneath the altar, there is a crypt where there is the place of Jesus' birth. And you say, well, that doesn't look much like a manger. And I'll tell you, no, it doesn't. Because when it was built, it was a cave. And what they did is they only wanted to save the spot where Jesus was born. And so they cut away all the other stone and covered that spot with marble. And then there is this silver star that is over this hole where you can reach in and touch down below the original bedrock, what's believed to be the floor of the manger where Jesus was born. And this has been venerated again since the first century. Remember, that's why Hadrian in the second century built a temple on this spot to keep people from this place. But this is underneath the altar of the Church of the Nativity in the crypt. And this part is controlled by the Greek Orthodox, and it's also controlled by the Armenians. And I've been there when they've been fighting with each other, you know, it just kind of, yeah. And again, this is all part of the status quo. The Catholics can get in here at certain times. The Greek Orthodox can get in. The Armenian Apostolic, they can get in, but it's all controlled by the status quo. But this is where pilgrims come, and any denomination of pilgrim can come in. And what you do is you reach down and pray, and you touch the floor of the stable. Outside of Bethlehem is what's called Shepherd's Fields. And, you know, for a long time, this has always been, the area around Judea is not very good agricultural land. It's very rocky. The joke is that when God created the world, he had a big bag of rocks, and he took 50% of them and scattered them all around the world. And the other 50% he dropped in Judea, because it is such a rocky place. And so the soil is very shallow. And so the only really good thing that happens is you can grow some olive trees, you can grow some vines in good places, but most of the area is only really good for raising sheep. And so it's still a highly pastoral area to this day. And Shepherd's Fields were, again, where we remember how the angel appeared to the shepherds. The main church in Shepherd's Fields is this one, and it's done by my favorite architect in the whole world, whose name was Antonio Berluzzi. He was the Italian priest who created these churches. And what he would do is the Franciscans bought these spots where there were just ruins. There was the ruins of the Byzantine church that was built in the 4th century, and the Crusader church that was built in the 11th century. And he sat in the ruins and he would just read over the passages of the scriptures over and over and over again until he came up with a design for his church. And this is a very small, modest church. It's a circular church, and it's covered by a dome. And the dome is filled with these glass pieces so that it looks like the stars in the sky. And so you see all around the angels are announcing glory to God in the highest and peace on earth to people of goodwill. That's what it says in English. And underneath there is the altar, which is held up by 4 angels. And on the walls, there are different murals that depict the story of the Nativity. Like that one. And it's the story of this area. And usually when I go to Bethlehem, it's very hard to celebrate Mass. There is St. Catherine's Church, but most of the time I've always celebrated out here in Shepherd's Fields, because there's the church by Bertoluzzi. And unfortunately, in the 7 times I've been there, there's never been a Mass there. They have other grottos, other limestone caves around there, and that's what are used for Mass. This is one of them. This is one of the larger ones. It's very nice, and it holds a larger number of pilgrims. There's another one that's a little smaller, and I've been stuck in there a couple of times. Oops, we missed that. Where did we miss that? Oh, okay. Well, it was there earlier today. And the funny part about that one is that it's a smaller cave, and the altar is put against the back, near the back, and so I can't stand up straight. The ceiling is that low, and every time I've celebrated Mass there, I pick out gravel from my scalp for the rest of the day, because and people of course think that's very funny to watch me try to do Mass with, and you know how I raise my hands, and I can't do that without scraping them on the ceiling. Yeah, it's a wonderful place. But you know, this is the kind of place that would have been used for the animals. And that's what's beautiful about this place in Shepherd Field. We know that, you know, the time between Jesus' birth and his public ministry is about 30 years. And one of the first things that Jesus does is he goes to John the baptizer, who is baptizing across the Jordan, and he asks to be baptized. And this is the Jordan River, which is not a really amazing kind of place. It's kind of a very slow moving river, because so much of the water is siphoned off as it flows down, as you saw in that map of Israel earlier. It flows down almost 90 miles past into Judea and into the Dead Sea. And so much of it gets pulled off for agriculture now that by the time it gets down to this area, it's really just slow moving and there's not a lot of water. But it's here that we venerated the baptism of the Lord Jesus for centuries. And there are a couple of places that we use. One of them, okay, I'm sorry, I'm going to go back. There's a question about the church in Shepherd's Fields. When was that incorporated? All of that is all together. That whole site is by the Franciscans. They have at least 5 different places to celebrate Mass when you go to Shepherd's Fields. There's the church, there are the 2 caves, and I take that back. There are 3 more places outside where pilgrims can gather, because sometimes there are so many people that want to celebrate Mass there. They'll have as many as 6 Masses going on at the same time in different places. So that's all part of that Shepherd Fields complex. This is the Israeli side, where they commemorate the baptism of the Lord Jesus. And there are some of the more literal kinds of Christians who come on pilgrimage. They tend to be more fundamentalist, and they'll be baptized again. And this is a site that Israel provides on their side of the Jordan for baptisms to take place. This was not where Jesus would have baptized, because he would have been baptized in the river. So we're going to go and see where the Jordanian side now. And near that, there is a lovely place right along the river. In fact, the last time I was there, that's where we celebrated Mass, right at the edge of the river, which was wonderful. But nearby, actually, the King of Jordan has donated land to 9 different religious communities. So they build their own churches. So there's a Greek Orthodox church, a Russian Orthodox church, a Syrian Orthodox church. There is a Protestant church, and this is the Catholic Church, and it's almost completed. And it's a lovely little place, but it's still under construction because It's all done by donations. On Good Friday, we have the Holy Land collection, and part of that money goes to build places like this. And this is on the Jordanian side, but again, it wasn't complete when I was there the last time. This is all part of that complex. And again, what they do is they've created a series of places where masses can be celebrated so that you can have several different groups accommodated all at the same time, instead of one group waiting until the next one gets done. So that, you know, it just kind of, this is one of these little ones. And there's a place for the people to stand out in front. Now we're going, remember, after the baptism, Jesus went up into the desert. Oh, I don't know when Shepherd's Church, the Church of Shepherd's Field was built. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know the date of the building, but I'm going to say it was probably sometime after 48, after the state of Israel was created, but I don't know exactly the date when it was completed. Going back now, we're looking at the hills over from Jericho up to what's called the Mount of Temptation. Jesus went off into the Judean desert, and there he was tempted by Satan, we're told. And there were three things. He was shown all of the world and told that if he would bow down and worship Satan, he could have all of this. He was taken to the temple and told to throw himself off. He was also told to turn the stones into bread. And all of that is commemorated here. And you can see in those, on the side of this mountain, there's a construction. We're going to get a better picture of that next. That's the monastery, the Greek Orthodox monastery of the Mount of Temptation. And that has been rebuilt. It's been destroyed, but rebuilt by the Greek Orthodox. And it still to this day is a working monastery. And there are people that go up there. I mean, I've never been there. It's not an easy place to get to, but it's still, there are monks there that pray and study, and you know, they live their life there. And it commemorates that place where it's believed Jesus was tempted. From the Mount of Temptation, we're going back into Galilee. That's the nice thing about doing this virtually, because we can travel 90 miles in the turn of a picture. This is the 19th century Church of Cana. It was built toward the end of the 1800s. And as I recall, it's somewhere in the 1890s. There's a plaque above the main entrance, and I remember seeing that. But this is a very traditional style church. It has its own courtyard. And again, there are 3 or 4 places in this complex where masses can be celebrated besides the church itself. And inside the church, of course, there are large stone water jars. Inside the church, thank you. Inside the church, there are these large stone water jars that give us an indication. In fact, although these are supposed to be that, they're not really that small. They're about twice the size, those stone water jars. But this is the interior of the church at Cana, where we celebrate the wedding feast of Cana. And it's one of those things, every time I've been there on pilgrimage, what I've done is, this is where we've invited the married couples to renew their marriage vows, is around the altar in this little church. And it really is a lovely little place. It's not very big. It's kind of hard to have mass there because, as you can see, the pews only hold a couple of people, and the spaces that they have beyond here make it a little easier. From Cana, we move up into northern Galilee, and we go to the place that commemorates the Sermon on the Mount. This is another Bertoluzzi church. You can see it. The arrow was just there. And then there is a monastery that is connected to it that houses nuns who run a hostel there for pilgrims to stay. And they also run a a dining room, and several times along the way when we've been on pilgrimage the last few years, that's where we've had lunch that day. We gather in at the Church of the Mount of Beatitudes, and we celebrate liturgy, usually in one of the mass areas around there. There are, I'm going to say, 9 different mass areas, or approximately 9. I can't say that's the correct number, around there for you to celebrate Mass, because the church is not that big. I've only celebrated Mass once inside of the Church of the Beatitudes. And the problem with it is, as you can see in a moment, the altar is right in the center. And so people have to be standing behind me, and I have to have my back to them as part of the prayer. And so that was a very interesting, that's the first time I've ever prayed the liturgy with my back to people. But you see here in this view, this little church, and again, there's a dome over it because it commemorates a sacred event. And you see those stained glass windows that are below that dome. And the dome, there are 8 of those windows, and each one of them says in Latin, I was hungry and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was ill and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to see me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And the just will ask when, and he will say, whenever you did it for the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. And so this is Berluzzi's church, again, that commemorates, it's one of his early ones, like the Church at Shepherd's Fields, that commemorates the Sermon on the Mount. And again, you can see how the land, Ron, go back to the overall picture. Go back a couple. One more. You can see how the land flows down to the Sea of Galilee. And it makes, there's a natural kind of amphitheater there, so that, again, Jesus, when he would have been speaking to the crowds, they would have been able to hear him because his voice would have been naturally amplified. Again, is this a place where we know the Sermon on the Mount took place? Nope, haven't a clue. But it's one of those places that it would have been a great place if he had done it there, because it would have worked really, really well. And so, again, that's why we commemorate that event here. We're going to go on. And now we're in Capernaum. That's where Jesus spent most of his time. Even though he grew up in Nazareth, he left there when he began his public ministry. And according to what the gospel tells us, he only returned there once. And there, when he returned, he was mistreated by his own family and friends who grew up with him. And he never, according to the story of the gospel, went back. He stayed at Capernaum, which is by the Sea of Galilee. It was a fishing town, and that was the way it thrived. This is a synagogue that was built in the 2nd century, actually by a Roman centurion. He paid to have this rebuilt for the Jewish community of Capernaum. And it's built more in a Roman style. And so you can see the pillars. This is an artist's conception of what it would have looked like. There were the inner pillars that held up the roof, and the lower section would have been where the men were, and the upper section would have been where the women were. So you see at the very right side, there are all these doorways that go in, but there's one up above here. That would have been the entrance for the women, because they would have stayed up above and in back, because that's the way the synagogue was laid out. In the center, there is the Bema, and that is where the Torah would have been proclaimed. There's also a chair there called the Chair of Moses. That's where the rabbi sat. And then there's the ark that's down right there. That ark was where the scriptures were kept. And usually there was a light burning near it, a candle or some sort of oil lamp. This is another view of the the synagogue at Capernaum. And this comes from Ron's own collection. When he was there back when he was a student, and one of his friends is standing there, we're looking for the picture of the young Ron, and we may or may not see that, but hopefully we will. But this is the exterior of that church, or that synagogue. And again, it's another one of those. That's another view of that. Where we're heading next is Peter's house. And you can see on the sign here, there is the overall layout. The archaeologists have uncovered it. And you see in the center, there is a circular room in Peter's mother-in-law's house. And we're going to be looking at that momentarily. This is one of the newest churches that was built in the Holy Land. It was built since 1990. I'm going to say it was under construction when I was there in 84, and it wasn't finished until I was there in 2011. But it looks like a spaceship because it's built on these massive pillars and steel, so that it sits above the ruins of Peter's mother-in-law's house. So it isn't like the old Byzantine church that was built over the ruins, or the old Crusader church that was built over the ruins. It's built above them so that we can actually see that house. And inside the church, there is, in the very center, you see the altar, and then in front of that is this area. And what you do is you go up to that, and you can see, as you can see on the left side, there are windows, and you can look down and you can see in that circular room, that's the place where it was venerated in the first century already as being the room where Jesus slept when he stayed with Peter. And part of the reason why archaeologists believe that that would have been the room is because at some point, this circular room was plastered and covered with frescoes, which the archaeologists have uncovered. And it appears that it was used as a shrine after the first century. And so that's why the church is built above that, so that you can actually look down in there. Instead of building a crypt down to go there, you can go and look through this and see the ruins, but see that circular room. In Galilee, there are different miracles of Jesus that are commemorated, and this German church is the one that commemorates the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. It is a typical Byzantine style. So there's this wonderful courtyard that leads up to the basilica. You're looking at the entranceway, and if you look in the doorway on the left, if you look at that, you can see there are pillars there, because there's a walkway all around the courtyard, and it's open with trees and plants and a fountain in the courtyard, which was very typical of the Byzantine style basilica. And this is the interior, and it's built in the same fashion as it would have been built by the Byzantines in the 4th or 5th century. And it was reconstructed by a German community in a place called Tafka. And it commemorates the multiplication of the loaves. Under the altar, there is a stone that dates back to the Constantinian church, the days of the Byzantine church. And in front of it is the mosaic floor that dates back to that 4th century. And it shows the loaves and the fish, the 5 loaves and the 2 fish that were brought by the young boy that Jesus multiplied to become enough to feed over 5,000. From there, we're going to Magdala. And Magdala, again, is along the Galilean Sea. And what is interesting is, from the time of the 1st or 2nd century, it was destroyed by the invading Romans during the Jewish revolts. And it was never rebuilt. Capernaum was rebuilt after the first revolt and not after the second. So from 135 on, it was never rebuilt. Capernaum, Magdala, Chorazin, Bethsaida, all of those places that Jesus condemned in the gospel were never rebuilt after the second invasion of the Romans. What happened is that the Legionnaires of Christ, which is a 20th century order, bought this land in what had been Magdala. They knew that this is where Magdala had been located, but there had never been any archaeological work done there. They wanted to build a hotel for pilgrims. And so they bought the land, they started to build the hotel. And as they were excavating for the hotel, they found some ruins. And they continued to build the hotel, but then they came and uncovered all of these ruins to show us the village of Magdala. And the word Magdala is probably from the Hebrew Migdal, which means ladder, because Magdala was known for its smoked fish. There were these ladders, cone-shaped ladders, that they would hang fillet of fish on, and they would build fires underneath and smoke the fish. And this smoked fish was known throughout a good part of the Middle East. And that was one of the treats that came from Magdala that they sold far and wide. What you're looking at now on the right is part of a synagogue that dates back to the 1st century. You can see the floor. Notice that it's a geometric pattern. It's nothing that looks like human or animal, because in a Jewish synagogue, you would never do anything that looked like an animal or a human being, because that would be a graven image. So they have a lot of fruits, trees, and geometric patterns. This synagogue was probably there in the time of Jesus, at least according to the archaeologists. And this would have been one where he might well have visited and preached, because we know he went from synagogue to synagogue. And that's the main area. But this is all part of the floor. What's interesting is, this may have been where Mary of Magdala encountered Jesus. This is another view of that 1st century synagogue. You can see it a little bit better. You can see that pattern down below in the center, that geometric pattern, and you can see more of the mosaic that was there. And again, this was the 1st century synagogue. This is a part of that. Again, this was part of the artistry that decorated that. This shows the menorah and large stone water jars. Again, you wouldn't see anything that looked like a pagan image. This is the modern day church that was built by the Legionnaires for Christ. And what's interesting about this place is that it's built right at the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And so it's designed to give you this image of Galilee. And so there's lots of light that pours into this church. You notice the altar up there is shaped like a fishing boat. It's a terrible altar, but it's great for looks, but it's lousy for liturgy. What's beautiful about this is that there is this green colored marble that covers the floor, and it's highly polished. Just beyond the glass wall behind the altar, there is a pool of water from the Sea of Galilee. And so it looks like a continuous image all the way across through the glass. That's the way the architect designed this, which is really kind of nice. And the water then flows down, it's pumped up from Galilee and flows down into the Sea of Galilee. And that altar is actually the size of a real Galilean fishing boat. This is the entryway you can see going into the church. This is the narthex of there are all these chapels that go off this main entrance for different groups, so that there can be several different groups of people celebrating liturgy at the same time. And down below, there's a crypt in that one too. This is a view of the Sea of Galilee. And I tell people again and again when we go on pilgrimages that we're not going to actually necessarily see the things, you know, we don't know for sure if this is where Jesus multiplied the loaves. We don't know for sure if this is where Jesus met Mary of Magdala. We don't know if for sure if even this is where Jesus was born or died. We have a good reason to believe it might be, but you know, we're not going to see the places or the places, the actual places. We're going to commemorate the events. But the one thing that always happens on a pilgrimage is we always go out onto the Sea of Galilee. And they have all of these boats. This is a big tourist and pilgrim thing. You go out on one of these boats into the Sea of Galilee, and you see the same hills that Jesus saw. You're on the same water that Jesus was on. It is very much an impressive, this is the actual place. And what's interesting is you can see the Sea of Galilee, the shore all around it. It's not a sea in what we think is a sea. In Michigan, where we have the Great Lakes, Houghton Lake and the Sea of Galilee are about the same size. So that gives you a perspective of how big the Sea of Galilee is. But it's a wonderful thing. This is a picture of sunset over the Sea of Galilee that Ron took when he was a pilgrim there back in his younger years. From there, we go up to Caesarea Philippi. About halfway through Matthew's gospel, the disciples and Jesus go up to Caesarea Philippi, and they're in pagan territory. This is now called Bernays in Arabic. And you can see the Roman construction. Caesarea Philippi was a Roman city. And so this was a shrine. There is water that flows out of this that actually then becomes the headwaters of the Sea of Galilee. But it was also considered a sacred place by pagans. And that's what you saw in those little niches. Yeah, sorry about that. You see those niches in the limestone walls. That's where pagan shrines were placed. You know, different statues of pagan gods and goddesses, because this was worshipped as a holy site because of the waters. This is the beginning of the waters of the Jordan that flow down into the Dead Sea. This is what keeps the Sea of Galilee filled. And the water flows from here. And you can see how it goes from a small trickle into a greater body of water and flows down. On the way down from Caesarea Philippi, on the plain of Jezreel, and Galilee is pretty much a flat area. It's surrounded by mountains, and one of them sticks up right in the middle, and it's called Tabor. And it's long been venerated as the place where Jesus would have gone with Peter, James, and John up the mountain, and he would, hold on, go back, Ron. Sorry. He would have gone up there, and that's where he was transfigured. You see that roadway? That's the only way to get up there. And the way you get up there is by 15 passenger vans going up all of this hairpin. Yeah, it's terribly unexciting or very exciting, depending on how you look at it. But that's the pathway up there. The first time I went there back when I was younger, I was only 34. I walked up, and you know, the couple of us that did that, and we got up there just as the last group came from our group up to the top at Tabor. Up at the top there was at one time, there was a Byzantine monastery and church up here, a basilica. Then that was destroyed, and it became, the Crusaders built a church and monastery up here. They also had a place, because this was a great place to control all the territory down below. So this was also a fortress up here as well, which is why it was destroyed again when the Muslims invaded. And now it is a church that's built by Bertoluzzi. And again, Bertoluzzi came and sat in the ruins of the Byzantine and the Crusader churches and prayed and read the scriptures and came up with this design. There are the 3 tents depicted here. One for you, Lord, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. And there are little chapels in the base of those bell towers on the side And it's the Moses Chapel and the Elijah Chapel. Inside, there is the crypt, which you see down below. And then there's the main altar up above, which is again very typical of a Byzantine style church. You can see that depicted much better here. The crypt, remember, Jesus was preparing his disciples for his death. And so the crypt down below, Bertolucci designed to be reminiscent of a tomb about the burial of Jesus. And up above, it shows the transfiguration where Peter, James, and John are there, and you see Jesus transfigured with Moses and Elijah on either side. And that's what's depicted in the main part. I've always been able to celebrate Mass, except for one time, down in that crypt. It's one of my favorite places to celebrate Mass. It's one of those beautiful places, and you have this sense. Go back one slide, if you would. And I just want to make a comment about the ceiling. The ceiling is rather plain. And the reason is when Bertolucci designed this, what he imagined was this ceiling was supposed to be made of white alabaster sheets. And so the whole inside of this church would have been flooded by light pouring through this white alabaster. And Bertolucci was a great architect, but a lousy engineer. And after it was built, the ceiling leaked like a sieve. And so they had to take all the alabaster off and they replaced it with a regular building material. And so as a consequence, it's not flooded with light like Bertolucci planned. But I just love that story. Sorry. On our way down to Galilee, from Galilee down to Judea, we go through Samaria, which is the route that Jesus would have taken, and it brings us to a place called Shechem. And Shechem, or Sychar, is where Jesus met the woman at the well. We hear that in John's gospel, that story. We heard that on the third Sunday of Lent this year. And this Russian Orthodox Church, one of the few places that the Franciscans didn't get, the Tsar of Russia bought and started building a church over this spot in 1910. Unfortunately, with the Russian Revolution, the construction stopped and nothing happened until almost the 21st century. And at the end of the 21st century, there were the Russian oligarchs, the ones who made tons of money, gave money to the Russian Orthodox Church to finish this. This is one of the very few Russian Orthodox churches in all of Palestine. And underneath the altar, in a typical Byzantine fashion, there is the shrine, and there is the well that was believed to be Jacob's well, from which he fed, where he watered his flocks. And again, the story is this is where Jesus would have met the woman at the well and asked her to give him some water. And part of the deal is you read the story when you get down there, and then actually you pull up a bucket of water. There's still water in that well. It still is a good spring, and the water is really rather good tasting. And so pilgrims gather around and they pray and they drink the water. From Shechem, you go down to Jericho. And there are two important stories that we hear in the gospel. We hear one is the story of Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, whom Jesus cures. And what's interesting about that story is we actually know his name. So many of the other people that Jesus cured, we don't know their names, but we know the name of Bartimaeus because he must have been known by the community. And so they include his name. But what also happens is that after Jesus cures him, the gospel says he followed Jesus up the road. He became one of Jesus' disciples. And that's what we commemorate here in Jericho. There actually is no church in Jericho, but this is a sycamore tree. There's another one we're going to show you. And that's where we commemorate the other main event of Jericho, which is the story of Zacchaeus, who, being short, climbed the sycamore tree so that he could see Jesus, only to be invited by Jesus to he wanted to stay at his house. And so Zacchaeus then had this great conversion, and it was a wonderful moment. And those two things, but it's interesting, there are no churches in Jericho that commemorate those events. Jericho is a wonderful place. It's the Israelis, until the problems erupted, love to come down there because it's always a beautiful place to be. You see all those palm trees. It produces fruit and vegetables all year long because it's such a wonderful place. It's well watered, and it's also, the temperature is great. This is part of the trip along the road that leads through Samaria. And this is how you would go from Jericho to Jerusalem. It's interesting that the road from Jericho to Jerusalem, it's only 40 miles between those two places. 40 miles and 4,000 feet. Jerusalem is 4,000 feet above the city of Jericho. So in the winter, you can get a snowfall in Jerusalem, and 40 miles away in Jericho, people are wearing shorts and a t-shirt, and they're very comfortable. So your ears will pop as you go from Jerusalem down to Jericho. But it was a 40-mile journey, which was not easy because it was all up to Jerusalem. There is a place along the way that's called the Good Samaritan Inn, and it probably isn't where it was, but again, we commemorate that place where in the story of the Good Samaritan, he was brought there and was cared for by the Samaritan, the man who had fallen among thieves. And you see the camel there. Ron actually rode a camel like that when he was there in Israel.
Oh.
I've been there 7 times and nobody got me on a camel yet. So I'm just saying, I'm too big to be on those things. Near Jerusalem, there's another place called Bethany. And we heard of that with the resurrection of Lazarus. This is the church of St. Lazarus. This is another Bertoluzzi church. And it's designed to look like a tomb that was not cut into rock, but one that was built out of rock. And what happens is the exterior is this light colored limestone, because the outer part of tombs were all light colored, but inside the tombs were made of the cheaper stone called basalt, which is very dark. This really doesn't show it all that well, but when Bertoluzzi designed this church, which is another little cruciform church, he designed it so that the walls are this dark stone and you have the light stone on the outside. And it just, you celebrate the resurrection of Lazarus in this place that you see depicted in the fresco on the wall, but the echo in there is phenomenal. And when you get to the part of the gospel that says, Lazarus, come out, you feel the tingle in the spine. You know, you really are looking for him to come. It's a beautiful little church. On the Mount of Olives, just on the opposite side from the Mount of Olives, is a place called Bethpage. And that's where the journey to Jerusalem began on Palm Sunday. That's where Jesus said, find the colt and bring him to me. And this is the exterior. This is another 19th century Franciscan church that was built there. And every year on Palm Sunday, as you can see, the pilgrims come pouring from Bethpage out of that place down Palm Sunday Road, which comes down the Mount of Olives into the city of Jerusalem. And along the way, this is without the pilgrims. This is what it looks like. And the walls were built to separate the olive groves from the people so that, you know, that they didn't destroy the olive groves. All the olive groves are now gone because all of the Mount of Olives has been taken up, not with olive groves, but with tombs. There are graves all over it. Halfway down Palm Sunday Road is this little church called the Church of Dominus Flevit, which means the Lord wept. And again, it's this wonderful little Bertoluzzi church. It's designed to look like a teardrop. And when you get on the inside, there are some of the original mosaic floors from the old Crusader and Byzantine church. But you have the altar there, and it looks out over the city of Jerusalem. Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem, looked over the city and knew that they would reject him, and he cried for them. Shortest verse in the whole of the gospel. It simply says in Latin, Dominus Flevit, the Lord wept. And that's what this commemorates. This is part of the floor that you see. And then the part of what remains from the original churches of the Byzantines and the Crusaders. When you come down Palm Sunday Road, at the bottom of it, in the time of Jesus, there was a bridge that went across to this place, which is called the Beautiful Gate. And that was the gate that you entered into to get into the temple when you were coming into Jerusalem. That gate has been there in almost every reconstruction except for the Roman one from the time of before the time of Jesus. And it's believed by both Christians and Muslims that when Jesus returns for Christians, or when the Messiah comes for the Muslims, they believe that Jesus or the Messiah will enter through this gate, because that's the long tradition on the day of the end. And scattered below in the Kidron Valley here are all of these tombs. Most of these tombs are not Jewish. They tend to be Christian and Muslim, because there are many who want to be buried here, because when the Lord comes, they'll rise from their grave to greet him first. And up the Mount of Olives, which you can't see from here, up the Mount of Olives is all of these Jewish tombs that cover the whole Mount of Olives. It's utterly amazing, but it's this huge cemetery for 3 different faiths who are all waiting for the Messiah. And this is Ron on a camel. If you notice, the hair is a little longer. He keeps it as short as that camel hair is now. But in any case, you can see from the Mount of Olives, you can see across to the Dome of the Rock. That is the shrine that was built in 691 over the place where Muhammad ascended into heaven and returned in one night. Near that, to the come back. To the left of that, you see that building. That is further over. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's the place where Muslims pray. The shrine is a beautiful place. It's covered with these beautiful mosaic tiles and this golden dome. And the mosque, the other mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, is this huge place where 2,000 people can come and pray. And it's covered with all of these Persian carpets. And it's where the services are held. They're not held in the Dome of the Rock. That's just for prayer and to commemorate Moses. Well, we can go on. The Dome of the Rock is built over where the temple once stood. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what the temple might have looked like in the time of Jesus. And what you see is the temple itself, which was not a very big building. The temple is that big building, and the rest of it is all the temple complex. In the background, you can see on the same level is all of these pillars. That's Solomon's portico. That's where Jesus would have taught when he gathered the crowds around him. All around the temple itself is called the Court of Israel. That's where Jewish men could go to pray. And then in front, there is this other place that has those circular steps that go up to the gate that would be opened. No, down here, down. Ron, down here. This place. No, up. No, down. There. That's what we're looking at. That is the court of the women. That's where the women would have gone to pray. And so the men would have been in the inner court. The women would have been able to see through. The altar is built between the temple and that doorway. And that's where sacrifice was offered. The only one who could go into the temple were the priests. And the only one who could go in the back part of the temple, which was called the Holy of Holies, was the high priest. And he could only go in once a year. We've got another picture of the temple to show you. And you can see it again. It says the courtyard of the priest, but that's not right. That's the courtyard of Israel. And this is the court of the women. And all around that is the court of the Gentiles, because people came, and they came to view this because it was one of the great wonders of the world. And you can see up above, oh, go back. I just noticed that. You can see up in the right-hand corner here, it shows the women's court and the court of Israel and the temple itself, and it compares it to American football field. And so this space where the temple and the courts of Israel and the court of the women stood was bigger than two American football fields. So it'd be like 300 yards by 300 yards or more than that, just to give you some size of the scope. And the whole temple complex was 20 acres, and it was all covered with stone. Okay. On the Mount of Olives, not by Palm Sunday Road, but a little bit further beyond that, is a place called Pater Noster. The Church of the Pater Noster celebrates the giving of the Our Father. In Matthew's gospel, it happens in Galilee. In Luke's gospel, it happens in Jerusalem. And so this is the Jerusalem Pater Noster Church. This is Luke's version. And this church has, it's an amazing little place, because on the walls, it has in 188 different languages, the Our Father, all printed on mosaic tile. And those are scattered all around the church. This is the original Byzantine church that you see here. And underneath there's a grotto that people go down there. And that's usually where we go. We read the scriptures of the story of the giving of the Our Father, and we pray that together down there underneath. Okay. You can see these different, and they're all the tiles, and it's in all of these different languages. You know, this one that you see, the biggest one, it's the Armenian, and it's written in Armenia. And the other one, you see it in Latin on the very left side. So this is that grotto underneath. We're going back. This is the tomb of Lazarus. Remember, Jesus was in Bethany the last time. Do we know where Jesus would have been? The question was, when Jesus was in the temple, when he was lost at the age of 12, do we know where he was? No. But again, this is a tomb. This is what shows you what the tombs are like. This is one, this is another. This is one that Ron took when he was in the Holy Land. And what it shows you is, you see that rounded thing? That actually is a stone that rolls over the entrance. This is like the one Jesus would have been buried in, because it was designed to be opened and closed. So every time a family member would die, you would place their body in this tomb, and it would decompose rather quickly, because the weather is so hot in Israel, that they would go in then and they would collect the bones, and they would put them in a box and put them on the shelf, and the next family member would be placed there. So the tombs were actually built for several generations of a family. They would all be buried in the same tomb. and the entrance was covered by a round stone that rolled back and forth. There was a little channel that was built in, and you would push it back, go in and place the body there on the shelf, and then you would roll the stone back. And it's very similar to the one where Jesus would have been buried. On Mount Zion, which Mount Zion is to Jerusalem what Grosse Pointe is to Detroit. That's where the upper crust lived. And so this was on Mount Zion, the upper room. This is not the upper room. This was built by the Crusaders, 1,000 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. But it's built on the site of where there had been a Byzantine church before. The strange thing is they really didn't build a church here. What they built was an upper room. And you can see that this is what it looks like. And it's very Romanesque, or Gothic, and it's not Romanesque, it's Gothic in its structure. And it's this upper room, which really is nothing like Jesus would have been in at the time, but it was where we commemorate the Last Supper. You'll notice that niche right directly ahead. And to the right, you see that little domed place. That's actually, the dome thing is the pulpit, and the niche is the indicator of which direction you find Mecca. Because just as when the Crusaders came into Jerusalem, they took the mosques and turned them into churches. This is one place that the Muslims took the church away and turned it into a mosque. It's no longer used as a mosque, but again, under the status quo, there's only one day in the year that Mass can be celebrated here, and that is on Holy Thursday night. But this is what the upper room looks like. The agony in the garden is what happened next, and it's commemorated at the foot of Mount of Olives. And you can see up in the right-hand corner, there's an Orthodox church, a Greek Orthodox church that commemorates the agony in the garden. But this church that's down below is the one that commemorates the agony in the garden. This is built over the original Byzantine church, and that was destroyed, and then over the Crusader church, which was destroyed. And Bertolucci sat in these ruins and designed this church. And there's this courtyard. You can see it to the left. Oh, okay. And no, that's okay. You can see it to the left, and then a better shot. We've got two more shots of that, of the courtyard, that as you're going into the Basilica of Gethsemane, there are olive trees here, which is where Jesus would have come and prayed. He would have stayed there, and it was known by his disciples. He always kind of came to the same place, and that's why Judas could find him. And it's at the foot of the Mount of Olives, across from the beautiful gate. And the olive grove here, these are some newer trees, but there is one tree that now dates back almost 1,000 years, 2,000 years to the time of Jesus. And so it's the interior of the tree has died away, but the exterior remains and still produces olives every year. When you enter the Church of All Nations, and it's called that because money to build it came from many different nations, and all of the nations that contributed to the building of this church were actually commemorated by the coat of arms for the different churches. You can see in the center, you can see the red, white, and blue. That's France. That's the French flag. Money came from all these different places. There's an American flag around there somewhere. But when you enter this church, it's interesting because the windows are purple alabaster. And so no matter how bright it is outside, it's always dark and sad inside. And all of these domes, there are 12 of them, they all, at the bottom of the dome, you see these branches. Those are the top of olive trees. What Bertolucci tried to create was this image of looking up through the olive trees into heaven. And so there are the stars in there. And it's this kind of idea of you're in the olive grove where Jesus came to pray in Gethsemane. The altar is built in the front, and you see Jesus praying on this rock. And the rock that's depicted in the mosaic on the wall is this rock down below in front of the altar. The altar is held up by a pillar that's shaped like a cup. Remember, Jesus prayed, Father, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but yours be done. And so the altar platform, it's made of alabaster and it's shaped like a cup. And you see then in front of the rock, you see another cup, which again, that whole idea of take this cup from me. This is the rock where it's always been commemorated that Jesus came to pray the night before, the night he was arrested. And it's surrounded by this small fencing that's shaped like a crown of thorns, because again, this is the beginning of the Lord's passion and death. And that's what's commemorated in this church. Back on the Mount of Mount Zion is the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu. And it's actually Saint Pierre Gallicantu, because this is a French church and it means St. Peter of the crowing rooster. And the church itself is built over what's believed to have been where the house of Caiaphas was located. So this is where Jesus would have been brought, perhaps, on the night he was arrested, and brought up this way. This is what's called the holy steps that are adjacent. The steps have been taken away. There were once steps here that were more obvious, because all throughout Jerusalem, there's no such thing as level except on Temple Mount. Everything else, you go up and down stairs, broad stairs, but it's all staired. And so these stairs were taken out and shipped to Rome during the Crusades and are now found in Rome. But this is the stairs, the pathway that Jesus would have taken, been led up to this church. And again, it's called the Church of St. Peter Gallicantu, St. Pierre Gallicantu, because this is where Peter would have denied Jesus in the courtyard. This is the interior of the upper church, and it's a beautiful spot. You come here, this is where you can have mass, but there are other places down below. And again, because of the number of pilgrims, there are at least 5 different places where you can have liturgy at St. Peter Gallicantu. The last time I was there, we had liturgy down in a garden down below, which was very, very nice. Underneath this, there, this depicts the Jesus being put on trial. That's what the mosaics show. That, by the way, is a stained glass window in the dome of that church. To the left, that's all stained glass. And so, on a bright sunny day, the light just pours through that window. It's gorgeous. But underneath, in the bottom, under the altar, there is this pit. And this is where we commemorate again, where Jesus was placed after he was put on trial, while he awaited being taken to Pilate for condemnation. And so that's the pit. There's another shot of that too. That's down below. That's at the bottom of it. And there is a small book with the scripture readings there. We're going back to the temple, another view of the temple. But what I wanted you to see is what's next to the temple, and that is called the Antonium Fortress. That was built by Herod the Great, and it was built as a way of controlling the crowds inside the temple. You see all of the court of the Gentiles and these towers. And so the Roman soldiers, if there was any kind of riot, which happened occasionally in the temple, especially on high holy days, the soldiers would go up there, and with their arrows, they were able to shoot down anybody that was rioting in the temple. And that's how they controlled the crowds. The Antonium fortress was also where Pilate met Jesus and where he was condemned. And we want to go on to the next picture, Ron. Yep, that's another view of the Antonium fortress. Underneath where this is the courtyard of that fortress that you could see surrounded by the four walls and those four towers. This is where Jesus would have been condemned to death. We heard on Good Friday it was called the Gabbatha stone, the place of judgment, but this is where it's called now the Lithostratos, which is the Greek word for it. This is where Pilate would have condemned Jesus. This is where Jesus would have been scourged. This is where Jesus would have been crowned with thorns. And this is under what's called the Convent of the Daughters of Zion. It's a religious community that has a convent above it, and this is underneath their convent. And these are the stones that date back to the days of Herod the Great. And in the stones, you see there are different places where they've etched a game called Basileia, which is the Greek word for king. It was called the Game of the Kings, and the Roman soldiers would take, and for sport, they would take a Roman soldier or a prisoner that was condemned to death, and only non-Romans were condemned to death by crucifixion. And they would play a game. They would roll a dice and they would move pieces around this board. There's another shot of this. They would move pieces around the board, and at different places they would do different things. So when Jesus was crowned with thorns, that was because they were playing this game, and that's what the board said should happen. So they did that with other prisoners as well. You know, I remember when I first saw this, I was heartsick, because somehow I had this image of Jesus and his crucifixion being this grand moment that the whole world stood still, and all of this happened. And I discovered that they did this to all kinds of others. There was no wonderful irony here. This was something that they did many times over to other prisoners along the way. That somehow Jesus was not as special as I had thought in the mind of the Roman. And so there was no great irony here. They were just playing a game with him as they led him to death. This is what's called the Ecce Homo Arch, because this is along the Via Dolorosa. After Jesus was scourged, Pilate brought him out and showed him to the crowd and said, "Behold the man, Ecce Homo." And that's where they began shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And this arch is part of the old Antonium fortress that was preserved. Along the Via Dolorosa, this is the chapel that's right there at that Ecce Homo Arch. There are chapels all along the Via Dolorosa, and this is one of them. This would have been one of the first ones that you would encounter. But the Via Dolorosa, and there's a beautiful map that Ron found that shows where Jesus was condemned to death, where he was the Ecce Homo Arch, where he was brought to the crowd. And this is the route that was laid out by St. Francis of Assisi as he tried to figure out how Jesus would have traveled. And so there's the first station, the second station, the third station, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh. The seventh one is interesting because there's another little chapel there. And in that chapel, when Pope Paul VI went to the Holy Land, there was such a huge crowd as he tried to make the way of the cross. He was walking along the Via Dolorosa. There was such a huge crowd that they were following him and pressing around him, that when he got to the seventh station, we saw this little chapel and he ducked inside. And the crowd kept going on to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this nun, because this is a convent that's there, came into the chapel after the crowd had passed by and saw the Pope sitting there praying. He had ducked away from the crowd and was hiding out in this little chapel, and then continued on his way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is again a picture of crowds. You do this, you rent a cross, and depending on the size of the crowd, you rent it, and people take turns carrying the cross from the church. This is the fifth station along the way, but that's what's here along the way. You see these markers. This is another sign of pilgrims, no particular group along the way. At least I don't know any of them. But when you go through this, you walk the way of the cross through the market area. And remember, on Good Friday, that was the Passover. And so the people had to go buy food. Jerusalem would swell from 600,000, that was the basic population, to over 1.2 million people. And they all had to buy their food. And so they would come into the market areas of Jerusalem, and Jesus' way of the cross pushed right through these market areas. And it was just chaos. It was just chaos. For those of you who have prayed the I was there way of the cross, the seventh station where Jesus falls the second time has the shopkeeper who complains because they're pushing this criminal through and he's blocking the entrance to their store, because it was one of the biggest shopping days in Jerusalem. And nobody paid attention to the fact that here was this criminal being led away to crucifixion. And so you still go through those crowds. This is now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And again, it looks a little bit like a fortress because remember, it was built in times of trouble. And so this is the Crusader church, not the Byzantine church built by Constantine. The Byzantine church was called the Church of the Resurrection. The Crusaders called it the Church of the Tomb, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is the entryway. And you can see, do you have a better picture of the ladder? Yeah, there's that ladder. Remember, I told you about the status quo in the 18th century, 1728. The status quo was created, and that ladder was up there because they were working on something. They were cleaning the windows or something, and the ladder can't be moved. It's been there for over 200 years. You know, it'll be 300 years at the end of this decade. But this is outside images. This is from the back of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. That ladder is above the main entrance. You think of the tomb of Jesus as being this cut into stone with a circular stone in front of it to close it off, like we saw in the picture that Ron had from Bethany. No. When Constantine built this church, what they did is they cut away everything except the place where Jesus' body was laid. And so that's the only thing that remains. And this is the structure that was built over it. There was one like this in the time of Constantine. And when the church was rebuilt by the Crusaders, they built one like that again. This has two sections. The first section is called the Holy Place. And the back part where you see this kind of dome is over the actual place where Jesus' body would have been placed. Remember the temple having two places, the holy place and then the Holy of Holies? That's the same pattern that's used here. And this has been reconstructed along the way, but this is where the tomb is. And then the next picture shows you where the body actually would have been placed, except that's not the stone. It's underneath that because too many people were trying to chip away at it. And so it's protected by being under another stone, a piece of marble. This is called the stone of anointing, where the body would have been placed and it would have been anointed in preparation for burial. This is around in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There are several different tombs, and this is one of them that's cut out of stone. Calvary is up above that cenacle where the tomb of Jesus actually was located. And you see here two different chapels. On the right is the Roman Catholic chapel, and it shows where Jesus was nailed to the cross and Mary standing nearby. And then you see the dome up above that commemorates where, that's Christ. But that's not above the Roman Catholic chapel. That's over the Greek Orthodox chapel that's right next to it, literally right next to it. And you see part of it here, and I'm going to show you the next slide, which that's the altar in the Greek Orthodox, and that dome is right above that altar. But this is a spot where, again, underneath this altar, there is an opening and a silver star that surrounds the opening, and you can reach in, as you see this one pilgrim doing. She's reaching in and touching the top of Calvary, and you can see the stonework on either side. But what you see is, again, you cannot touch Calvary because it was all cut away and left the spot where it's believed Jesus was actually crucified. And so it's symbolized by the cross that's up there. That's an icon crucifix with Mary and John on either side of that, all dressed in silver. After the resurrection, we know that there were several appearances. A number of them took place in the upper room where the Last Supper had been celebrated. But there's the last one in John's Gospel, which takes place on the shore of Galilee. And it's there that the disciples have gone out fishing, and they come in with the dawn, and they haven't caught anything, and they see somebody on the shore, and there's a small fire burning, and he calls out to them and he says, "Have you caught anything?" And they said, "No." And he said, "Well, lower your nets on this other side." And they did, and they caught this huge number of fish. And all of a sudden, the disciple John, who's always said the one Jesus loved, what he saw, what he said, "It's the Lord." And Peter, who was stripped, threw on his clothes and now jumps into the water and gets to the shore sopping wet. And there they have breakfast. But at the end of that, there's a very poignant scene that's depicted by the statue we're going to show you. This is the inside of the church that's called the Primacy of Peter. And it's built with the basalt stone. But again, this is believed to be the place, it's always commemorated, where Jesus met Peter. But this is the statue. And it's Peter kneeling before Jesus. And he says, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And Simon Peter says, "Yes, Lord." And then he says a second time, "Peter, do you love me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord." And finally, Jesus asks a third time. And remember, Peter would deny Jesus 3 times. And Jesus asked 3 times, "Do you love me?" And he says, "Yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs, feed my sheep, tend my sheep." And he said, "You will go where you didn't intend to go, and they will take you by force, and you will follow me." And that's the close of the Gospel of John, the last appearance of Christ risen from the dead. We go back to Jerusalem because, according to Matthew's Gospel, Jesus ascended into heaven from Galilee. But according to Luke's Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, he ascended from Jerusalem. And so we're back on just the ridge of the Mount of Olives. And there is the Church of the Ascension that was built by the Crusaders. But you notice that it's open because there was never a roof on this. This cenacle is built again over the spot where it's believed that Jesus ascended. And there are altars all around this for different communities, but it was turned into a mosque as well. And so the only day that Christians are allowed to pray here in terms of having Mass is on Ascension Thursday. But the cenacle is over the spot, and according to the tradition, there is a footprint there of Jesus ascending into heaven. You have to look really, really hard to see the footprint. I'm just saying, I don't know, but you have to look really hard. And then we come back to the upper room one last time, because after the ascension, they stayed in Jerusalem and they prayed. And on Pentecost, while they were praying, the Holy Spirit descended on them like a dove, or like flames of fire, and they were set on fire. There came this loud rushing wind that forced them out, and they began, as we heard on Easter Sunday, the apostles finally began to proclaim the good news of the resurrection. And so we followed from the incarnation, when Jesus was first conceived in Nazareth, all the way to when the Spirit of Christ is descended on us at Pentecost. And that's 2 hours. And I'm sorry for going that long, but I'm trying to condense 8 days into 2 hours. So I hope I didn't bore you, but I hope it was good.
Fantastic, Father. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well,
Yes,
you're
it was
welcome.
amazing, amazing.
Thank you very much, Father. It was incredible.
Thank you.
Very inspiring.
Thanks, Father. Vic and Kathy.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Father
Father.
Dave.
Well, you have to thank Colleen and Joanne. Colleen came right from the airport here to help with this. So
Great job.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Dave.